at yarn classifications. Yarns can be broken down into 3 major classifications, and that is simple, complex or novelty, and composite. Okay, and those classifications are based on how the fibers or yarns are actually put together to make the yarn, and the way that the yarns look along the length of the yarn. So today we're going to focus in on the simple yarns, and then Friday we'll look at novelty and complex yarns. So if we look at yarn classifications, what does that actually look like? So yarns can be classified and identified in several ways. With that, so as we classify them, we look at the fiber length, the twist, the size, the yarn regularity or irregularity along its length. And as we look at those, we will identify them as either simple, complex, or composite. And then with each of those categories, we begin to look at the actual way the yarns are put together, or the way it looks on the length of that yarn, to actually then begin to classify those down as to specific yarn types. Right. So if we look at classifying yarns based on fiber length, we looked at these last time. We have spun yarns, we have regular or smooth filament yarns, and we have textured bulk filament yarns. Okay, so our spun yarns, remember, are made from our staple fibers. Our filaments are made from our filaments. They can either be mono or multi-filaments. And then our textured or our bulk yarns are those where we've added crimp or texture to those yarns to either increase the bulk or the elongation properties of those yarns. So this is a spun yarn that is a simple yarn. And if you look at this, you can see all of the little fibers that are protruding out of the yarn, and those are called the fiber ends. And that's where the staple fiber ends, and as it's being put together as a yarn, those little ends aren't caught in the yarn, and so they make the fiber ends that stick off. This is what, when I talked about this, spun yarns are more comfortable to wear. These little fiber ends that are protruding off are what make that yarn actually lift up off of your skin, so that this type of yarn becomes more comfortable to wear. All right. The second way that we actually begin to classify yarns is the twist of the yarn. And so the twist is the spiral arrangement of fibers within a yarn. Okay. Twist is what actually holds our fibers together in spun yarns. So as we talked last time about the spinning processes, where you could use an open end rotor, or you could use other classifications, what we're doing in that process is that's where we're beginning to twist the fibers together so that they actually make that yarn. A yarn twist will impact the appearance of the yarn along its length, the fineness of the yarn, its strength, and its absorption. So fineness and strength increase with an increase in the amount of twist. So the more twist that you have in a yarn, the finer and stronger that yarn is going to be. However, the more twist that you add, the less absorbent that yarn is going to become, because you've tightly put the fibers in there, so you don't have air pockets in between the fibers in the yarn, so Therefore, water and air can't get into there as easily as if it had lower twist. So twist can come in two directions. When we put a yarn together, we have S twist or we have Z twist. So an S twist are yarns that are twisted in the clockwise direction. So as those fibers are put together, the twist is being inserted in the clockwise direction. And Z twist is created with a counterclockwise direction to the twist. Your Z twist is what is used most often in the industry to make yarns. And then the other part of twist is the amount of twist. So with the amount of twist, we're talking how many turns or twists per inch is put into that yarn. And when we talk about amount of twist, we have three different classifications that we use for that. So we have low twist, which is where we put about 2 to 3 turns per inch. So low twist is going to be a very weak yarn with that. So we use that in like filling direction of our yarns, of our fibers or fabrics, because there's not the strength in that yarn or other special applications. The average twist, so we have low twist, we have average twist, which is about 20 to 30 twists per inch. And this is where our clothing and most of our fabric yarns are done. Okay, so low twist is 2 to 3 turns per inch. Average is 20 to 30. And this is where most of your yarns are manufactured for clothing purposes. And then you have high twist or hard twist, and that's 30 to 40 turns per inch. And this would be more of your industrial or some of your upholstery fabrics where you need a stronger yarn for your end product. All right, so when we talk about twist, Z twist versus S twist, what we're looking at is the direction that the twist is applied into the yarn. So we have 2 yarns here, and right here you can see these diagonal lines that are running through your yarn. So this is what we're talking about, Z twist. So if you were to look at this, you can draw a Z across that yarn, okay? So the twist or the direction of this diagonal makes the center part of the Z. Okay. So this, this twist was, excuse me, was applied in a counterclockwise direction. Okay. This is an S twist. So you can see the diagonals are running in the opposite direction, and the diagonal makes the middle of the S. So we come around like this, and we can see an S as we're twisting our yarn to our fibers to make the yarn. Okay. All right, so this is when we're looking at the twist per inch. So this is this is a low twist versus a higher twist. So you can see in the same amount of yarn, excuse me, oops, you have more diagonal lines or more twists per inch than you do in a low twist. So as we add more twist, we're making a stronger yarn because we're making those fibers twist in there tighter, but we're also decreasing the absorbency of that because as you can see here, right here, you have more space in between there. You can get air and water in there. And as we begin to twist those tighter, those spaces become less defined, or they're tighter, or there's less room in those spaces. Also, your fiber ends are less that are protruding out the higher your twist, because we're twisting those in more, so those fiber ends are getting caught in the twist of the yarn. So this is an example again. This one is a lower twist. We actually have 1, 2, 3 twists versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost 7 twists in the same amount of inch of yarn. Another example of a twist. Oops. All right, so we have twist, and then we have yarn size, okay? So when we're talking about yarn size, we're talking about the denier of that yarn, or the diameter of that yarn, okay? And when we talk about yarn size, we have 2 ways of doing that. We have an indirect numbering system, and this is used for our natural fibers. Specifically, we have a indirect of cotton, woolen, and worsted. And these are all ways to measure the diameter of the cotton yarn. And it's an indirect numbering system because the larger the number, the finer the yarn. Okay, the larger the number, the finer the yarn. So an indirect numbering system is we have a certain mass of yarn, and that weight of yarn is then measured to see how long that yarn is, okay? So indirect numbering systems go off of a fixed mass and then determine the length of that yarn to determine the size of the yarn. Our other way is a direct numbering system, and this is your denier and your text, okay, which is the same thing that we use to measure fibers of our man-made fibers. So we use the same system to measure the yarn as we do the fibers. And this is a direct numbering system because the larger the number, the coarser the yarn, or the bigger diameter that the yarn is. Because with the direct numbering system, we measure a certain length of yarn and determine what is the mass of that yarn. Okay. So here's an example of using your indirect system. So this is using your cotton system. So you have 2/70, 2/30, 2/12, and I lost my number here, okay? But what this is telling us when we measure yarns for the size of it, we have 2 numbers that work with that. The number in front of the slash is how many yarns are actually used to make this yarn. So this yarn actually has 2 individual yarns that have been twisted together to make this yarn. So each of these have 2 yarns. So here's a yarn, and here's a yarn that's being twisted together. Okay. The number after tells us the diameter of each of those individual yarns. So the smaller yarns, the finer yarns, have a higher number for the actual size of the yarns as we do that. So the more coarse yarns are going to be a lower number. The finer the yarn, the higher the number. Again, so this is the wool. So a 3200 yarn versus a 1234 versus a 260. Okay, and that's telling us how many yards there are per pound of yarn. And with your indirect systems, they each measure differently, so they don't measure the same. So a cotton doesn't have the same number as a wool for the same length. So you have to have conversion charts to actually determine how much is there. Okay. Versus with our denier or a text, the smaller the number, the finer the yarn. Just like with the fibers, the smaller the number, the finer the fiber. All right, so then we also look at yarn regularity. Okay, and yarn regularity, we're looking at, this is where we begin to break them into our categories of simple or complex or composite. So yarn regularity is looking at the yarn along the length of that yarn as to, is it regular along the length or is it irregular along the length of the yarn? And so with regularity in our simple yarns can be divided into singles, plies, cords, and then even after that, they can be a rope, okay? So our yarn regularity with any type of single yarn is going to be a very regular yarn. So simple yarns are going to be regular all the way across the length or down the length of the yarn. The single ply, cord, or rope is telling us how many yarns are used to make that yarn. Our simple yarns can be either monofilament, multifilament, or spun, or it can be a combination of those. Our simple yarns, if we have a single, so a single means that individual fibers are put together to make the yarn. So if you untwist a single yarn, you're going to break it down to fibers. You'll be able to pull fibers out from that yarn. Okay. So a single yarn can be spun from staple fibers, or it can put multiple filaments together to make that single, or it could be a monofilament. Okay. So we have singles. Then a ply is that we take multiple singles and twist them together to make a yarn. Okay. So this is an example of a 2-ply because we have 2 single yarns that are being twisted together to make one yarn. Okay. A cord means that we take multiple plies and twist them together. So a cord, if you untwist it, you're going to twist into plies. And then you untwist those plies and you're going to twist into singles or down to your single yarns, okay? So when you begin to have plies, you classify that ply by how many single yarns are twisted together. So a 2-ply is 2 single yarns, a 3-ply would be 3 single yarns, a 4-ply would be 4 single yarns are twisted together to make that. Okay. All right, then if you also see, this says Z, so it has the Z twist to it. This is a Z twist, and this is a Z twist. But as we begin to twist yarns to make yarns, we have to alternate the twist. So if you're going to end up with a Z twist in a ply yarn, your singles have to be twisted in the S direction. Okay. And that's because as we begin to twist these together, if they were in the same direction, then the singles would actually untwist as you were trying to twist the ply yarn. So you have to twist them in opposite directions. Okay. So then you can see here that it goes back again. So if we want a Z as our final cord, then our plies are twisted in the S direction and our singles are twisted in the Z direction. So every time you twist, you have to alternate the direction of the twist. And like I said, in the industry, the majority of our fibers usually end up as a Z twist. All right, so here's an example of a rope. And this is a simple yarn because it's smooth and regular along the length of the entire yarn, okay? So we have our rope, and if we begin to untwist that, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 cords that have been twisted together to make our rope, okay? If we undo a cord, we have 1, 2, 3 plies, or 3 yarns that were twisted together to make a cord. So this cord has 3 yarns, this cord has 3 yarns, this cord has 3 yarns, this cord has 3 yarns. If we undo those yarns, we see that this is a 2-ply. So each of the yarns that was twisted together to make the cord has 2 yarns that were twisted together to make it. So that's a 2-ply. So 1, 2, 3 2-ply yarns were twisted together to make each of our cords. Okay. Our 2-ply, when you untwist that, you have 2 yarns that are singles, because as we untwist this, we begin to get fibers. And when you untwist a yarn and get fibers, you know you're at the most basic single yarn that's there, okay? So 2 singles twisted together to make the ply, 3 2-plies twisted together to make a cord, 4 cords twisted together to make the rope. Okay. Here's an example of different plies. So this is a linen yarn, and this is 4 different linen yarns depending on how many single yarns were put together to make that yarn. So this has 2 singles, 3 singles, 4 singles, 5 singles that were twisted together to make the yarn. Okay, and you can see that the twist is going in this direction here, so it's going in the opposite direction when you're making the plies. So again, this is a cord. You have multiple yarns that are twisted together. This is a single. If I untwist it, I get fiber ends. And then this is a ply because I have 2 singles that are twisted together to make a yarn. First, in your, it might have been in your swatch book, but in a black case, you have a specific viewing glass, okay? It probably came in a little case like this, okay? And you're probably gonna want that. Okay, so go ahead and take that out. And you open it up. It should have 3 parts to it. You open it up so that it sits like this. The bottom part has a square that actually has 1 inch in each direction. So 1 inch square, it's a hole. Okay, that's the bottom. And then your top is a magnifying glass. Whenever we look at anything, we're going to place it underneath the bottom of our square, and we're going to set our magnifying glass on top of that. Yarn book, I want y'all to, like we did in the fiber, go ahead and just number 1 through, we actually have, you have a slot for 18, but we actually have 17 yarns. So go ahead and number those pages 1 through 17. All right, so for your fiber swatch book, you actually stapled your fibers in there when it asks you to mount your swatches. I recommend that you either staple across the top of your packet where you can still open it, or what I did was I actually got double-sided tape and just taped my packets to my swatch sheets, because you're going to be able to staple your yarns down is going to be fairly hard to make sure that you get it there, and we want to be able to pull those yarns out. Okay, so let's look at just some basic yarns that we talked about last time in our group. So if you turn to number 4 and 5, okay, and find the yarns that look like this. So you have one that's clear, and it says monofilament 100% nylon, and you have one that's yellow, that says multifilament 100% Kevlar aramid. Okay, they're simple because as we look along the length of that yarn, it's smooth, it's regular, okay, so it looks the same the entire length of the yarn. So if you pull those out of your packets, let me get mine open. You pull out your monofilament, okay, you've got one fiber that makes that yarn, okay? It's smooth, it's uniform along the length, and there's one yarn. So this is a monofilament simple yarn. So what are some, so if we fill this out, okay, it's swatch number 4. The yarn type is monofilament, and it's 100% nylon. So monofilaments are usually smooth. They're regular along the length. All right, let's look at our multifilament. Okay, what do we know about our multifilament? Okay, so yarn name is multifilament, and our fiber content's 100% Kevlar aramid. The same all the way along the length of it, okay? So it's smooth, it's uniform. Okay. All right. This yarn, does this yarn have twist?
No.
No. Okay. So a simple multifilament yarn can be made without twist because the fibers are long. Okay, so the fibers are the length of the yarn itself. So we can use a multifilament yarn without adding twist. So there's no twist. Is there twist in our monofilament?
No.
No. Okay, so no twist. So our monofilament, our multifilament don't have to have twist. Number 11. Okay, so you're going to find your yarn that is, it's clear and it says tape on it. So it's a clear yarn. It's 100% olefin. All right, so your yarn name is tape. Your fiber content's 100% olefin. All right, is this simple, complex, or composite? Simple, okay? It's uniform, the length of the yarn. All right, is it monofilament, multifilament, or spun? Okay, it's monofilament because there's one fiber that's making this yarn, okay? We can't untwist this yarn, we can't pull this yarn apart into smaller fibers. So this is the fiber. All right, what else about this yarn? What's different about this yarn and the other monofilament yarn that we looked at? Yarns are flat yarns. So these are yarns that are created by extruding the raw material or the dope onto a sheet or a film, and then actually slicing or breaking the film into the size that we want to make our yarns. Okay, so these yarns are flat. Let's look at number 1. So for number 1, you're going to want to find a yarn that says simple single. It's kind of a peachy orange color. At least mine is, and it's 100% wool. Okay. So actually find 1, 2, and 3. So you're going to find your peachy colored one. You have a blue one, that says ply, and you have a white or slightly off-white that says cord. So go ahead and find those three. All right, so number one is a simple single. It's 100% wool. Okay. So how do we know it's a simple yarn? Look along the length of our yarn. It's regular the whole way, okay? It looks the same along the whole length of our yarn. Okay. How do we know that it's a single? Okay. The way that we know is if you begin to untwist this yarn, so we pull it apart, we untwist it, we're going to get fibers. So if I actually untwist and pull on that, I'm actually pulling out individual fibers. Okay, so that's how you know that you have a single, is that when you untwist it and pull, you're actually pulling fibers out. Does it have twist? Yeah. All right, so what twists do we have? Is it Z or is it S? And this is where you're going to want to get that magnifying glass to actually look at the twist. I was trying to get it so I can get it. So if we set our yarn down and then you place your magnifying glass on top of it. Let's see if I can zoom in on here. What direction are those yarns being twisted? Are going like this. So is that a Z or an S?
A Z.
So do y'all see that? Can you see that twist? So if you go across here, your diagonals are running like this. This is a Z twist yarn, and that it is simple because it's uniform, it's regular along the length. We know that when we look at yarns, if you have a natural fiber, your only exception is silk, but if you have any other natural fiber, you're gonna have to have a spun yarn and you're gonna have staple fibers, okay? All right. Let's look at number 2. This yarn name is Simple Ply. Fiber content is 100% cotton. Okay. All right. So how do we know it's a ply? Well, actually, first, let's look at that. How do we know it's simple? What about it is simple?
It has regular, it's like regular on the length.
Okay, it's smooth along the length. It looks the same, right? Okay. And then what's the twist? Okay, it's an S twist. So it's going the opposite direction of what we just looked at, right? So if we make our, so if we look at this, it's going in the S direction, so it's going clockwise, okay? So we can see those twists. All right. Now, it's a ply. How do we know it's a ply? If we actually undo that yarn, so go ahead and try to pull it apart, you're actually going to get it to pull into how many yarns?
2.
Okay. So when we pull a ply apart, we get yarns. Okay. So this one has 2 yarns that were made to make the ply. So this is actually a 2-ply yarn. Okay. All right, and how do we know that we are at our simple? So it has two simples that are put together to make the ply. How do we know that? Because if we try to untwist these yarns, what happens is we pull out cotton fibers. Okay, so you know you're at a simple yarn when you pull it apart and you get fibers. All right, so this is a 2-ply simple yarn. All right, so what direction was the twist of our ply? An S twist, then our singles must be what for a twist? So if we end up with an S, then we have to go back. The next row would be a Z, and if it had gone back again, then we'd be back to an S. But we have Z twist for our simple singles, and we have an S twist for our 2-ply. All right, let's look at number 3. 3 is cord, is the yarn name. The fiber content is 100% cotton. All right, so let's look at this. So if we have a cord, we know we have at least how many layers of yarns. Make a cord with twisted ply yarn. So we know that as we begin to look at this, we're gonna untwist and we should have some plies. We should be able to untwist some plies to get to our singles. So what is the direction of twist on our plot, on our cord? It's not focusing very well. Y'all look at that under your what do you get for? All right, let's pull it apart. And how many, and we'll come back to that twist. How many plies are put together to make our cord? So 3 plies to make our cord. Okay, what's the twist on our plies? Let's look at that way. Okay, so if our plies are an S twist, then our cord must be a Z twist. Okay, all right, so then if you untwist one of your plies, how many simples are used to make that ply? A 2-ply, that's 2 simples that are making our ply, 3 2-plies that are making our cord. So if our plies were an S twist, then our singles must be what twist?
Z twist.
The Z twist. And if we pull those singles, if we try to untwist those singles, what do we get? We've got it down to cotton fibers that are coming out. So we know we're at the most basic yarn there. So we know that this is a simple because when we pull it apart, we get fibers. Okay. Then the other yarn we're going to look at today is number 13. And 13 is actually just twisted paper. Don't really actually have true fibers, but we've taken paper and we have twisted it together to make a yarn. Okay, so what twist is in that paper? As we untwist it, you can see that S twist happening. Okay, so is this a simple, complex? What type of yarn is it? Is it mono, multi, or staple, would we call it? If I untwist it, Do I have one piece of something? Do I have multiple pieces? It would be considered a monofilament, even though we really don't have a true fiber, because we have one piece of paper that's being twisted together to make our yarn. Okay, paper, your fiber content's 100% cellulose. It has a S-twist. It's a monofilament. It's smooth.